Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for coming out for this special event. We're so glad to have you here. So just to give you a little background, Bonding Through Bars is an international roundtable that has been taking place for the last few days over at UBC. It's an initiative of the Peter Wall Institute for Advanced Studies, and it's a very exciting opportunity to bring together lots of different people to work together. So on our particular roundtable, we are very fortunate to have delegates from 5 continents working alongside women with lived prison experience, all with the overall goal of protecting the health and well-being of incarcerated mothers and their children. So I'm very pleased to present this exciting evening where we're going to have some wonderful international visionaries sharing a bit about what they're doing in their own countries, in their own context, to protect the children of these mothers. I'm going to hand it over to our moderator. We are very lucky to have a fabulous moderator. He's sitting in the middle there. It's Chesa Boudin, and he is a Rhodes Scholar. He's attended Oxford and Yale, and he currently works in the San Francisco Public Defender's Office. He's an author, and he's also the child of parental incarceration. So he will be guiding us through this wonderful evening, and I just want to thank you all for coming to this important event. Thank you.
Thank you, Samantha, and thanks to all of you for joining us tonight. It's been an intense couple of days, and I think it's a good point in the week for those of us that have been part of the roundtable to try to share some of our thoughts and process with the broader group. So I know all of us look forward to questions and feedback from the audience at the end, and we will be sure to save time for that. I want to jump right in by telling you a little bit about myself and my background, because my experience with parental incarceration is in many ways exactly what this week of conversation is all about. And then one by one, I'll introduce the other panelists, and they'll tell you about their experiences and their work on the issue. And it's a really impressive group. So I'm going to go fast because, like all of you, I look forward to hearing from them. When I was 14 months old, both of my biological parents were arrested and incarcerated in New York State. They played an auxiliary role in an armored car robbery that left 2 police officers and a security guard dead. For their role in the crime, my parents were both sentenced to long prison terms. My father to 75 years minimum, my mother to 20 years minimum, both of them with a life sentence as a maximum penalty. Because of their incarceration, I immediately, my life was thrown into tumult, and I had to find a new home, a new family. I was lucky that my biological parents had close friends who were willing to take me into their family. My adoptive parents already had 2 sons who became my brothers. Although I was too young to remember it, I've heard many stories over the years, and my earliest memories, in fact, are visiting my parents in prison. And in large part because of the trauma of my separation from my parents at such a young age, I experienced a wide range of developmental problems, learning disabilities, anger management, and it was a really tough period for the first 10 or so years after my parents were arrested. In many ways, the experience I had grappling with the anger, the shame, the stigma, the uncertainty, the instability is experience that almost all children with incarcerated parents can relate to. But there were also a number of factors in my life that were really unique, or that are uncommon amongst other children with parents in prison. So to give you a few examples, especially in the United States, I know also here in Canada, the majority of people who are incarcerated are people of color. And obviously I'm white, and my parents are white. It's relevant for a number of reasons, which I'll talk about, but perhaps the most relevant reason that I bring up race is because it's so closely correlated to class. And because I grew up in an upper middle class white family, I had access to tremendous resources that were absolutely essential in enabling me to overcome the obstacles I faced as a result of my parents' incarceration. And unfortunately, those resources, those support networks, are not available to the overwhelming majority of children with an incarcerated mother or father. So what I want to do tonight, just very briefly, is share a few kind of concrete examples of the experiences, the emotions, the challenges I had, and the ways in which the resources and supports that were available to me were so essential. And I do that by way of an attempt to emphasize the need to make those sorts of resources and supports more widely available to children in the situation that I found myself in starting at the age of 14 months. So after my parents were arrested, I felt a wide range of emotions. I was sort of on an emotional roller coaster, everything from fear to shame to stigma to anger. And I would often have violent outbursts in school and at home with my family, my new family. But one of the most acute and perhaps surprising feelings that I experienced on a recurring basis from a very early age was a sense of guilt, as though I had done something wrong. And for those of you with no experience in the field or no background, it seems totally illogical that a young child who couldn't even speak, much less understand what the law was and where his parents were going when they dropped him off at the babysitter that day, would feel guilty for something that they did. Well, let me explain. I, like so many children at that age, felt that I was the center of the universe, that everything my parents did and everything that happened in the world that I knew and inhabited happened because of me, and it was about me. And so when my parents didn't come home that day, and my mom wasn't there to breastfeed me, and I didn't go back to my apartment, I had no idea what was going on. And I internalized this sense that, well, maybe if I'd been more lovable, my parents wouldn't have risked losing me. I was lucky to have the support of therapists and a wide range of extended family to help me work through those feelings. And I remember one day when I was quite young, coming out of a therapist's office, and I was crying, and I was just saying over and over to my adoptive parents who picked me up, if only I could have talked, I would have told them not to go. Again, I was 14 months, so I just had a few words. I had no idea what my parents were doing that day. But for years, this idea that I should have warned them, I should have known to prevent them from getting into trouble, was with me. And it was really thanks to almost a decade of intensive therapy and support that I was able to work through those feelings and the anger. And instead of throwing chairs and books at my teachers when I felt that there was some minor injustice in the classroom, learn how to channel that energy into my studies, so that instead of throwing the books, I was actually reading them. It took me a few years to catch up with my classmates, but eventually I was able to do that. And there was another aspect of my childhood that in many ways sets me apart from most children with incarcerated parents. I knew since before I can remember where my parents were and why they were there. And most families choose not to tell their kids the full story. Most families choose to hide it as long as possible, and once it's impossible to hide it, to sugarcoat it and to teach the children not to talk about it in school, not to share the details of their parents' incarceration with classmates or friends or colleagues once they become adults. And there's a lot of reasons, understandable reasons why people do that. But my sense has always been that it teaches children from an early age to be ashamed. And it forces them to internalize a stigma that may be real and may exist, instead of empowering them to be agents for change and to go out into their communities and into the world that they inhabit and show people that actually there are many, many children who grow up with a parent in prison, and there's absolutely no reason to be ashamed of it. And in fact, it's an opportunity to educate the people we interact with about the realities of our criminal justice system. Obviously, Canada incarcerates far fewer people than we do in the United States, but in the United States, it's such a widespread, pervasive phenomenon that to pretend we don't all know somebody who has experienced parental incarceration is really a fallacy. It's a myth, and it's one that is only possible to perpetuate because of the silence, and the silence that all too often we impose on ourselves and on our families. So I never experienced that, and maybe that's why I'm here today, sharing my story with all of you. There's another factor I want to highlight. I don't have too much time, but I was able to visit my parents and have regular contact with them in ways that most children with incarcerated parents cannot. I visited my mother as often as once or twice a month when I was young. My father slightly less because his prison was more isolated. But I want to describe briefly for those of you who've never had the opportunity to visit a prison or never put yourself in baby shoes and imagine what it's like to visit a prison as a young child. My mother's prison is one of the best in the United States. It still is. It's widely recognized in the literature because of the kinds of programming for mothers and children that it has there. It has a large visiting room with an open-air patio attached to it, tons of windows, and a big portion of the visiting room is called the Children's Center. And it has a big rainbow painted over the door, carpeting, toys, stuffed animals, arts and crafts projects, books, everything you could possibly want for normal, healthy mother-child interactions. My father's visiting room has wall-to-wall tables that you can sit across and have an adult conversation with your father. Very little contact is allowed, and no games to speak of. These days, they don't even allow pens and paper for drawing. The challenge of trying to build or rebuild a relationship with an incarcerated parent in a setting like my father's visiting room is pretty much insurmountable. And if it weren't for the fact that New York State is one of only 4 states in the country to allow for overnight conjugal visits, I don't think that I'd have any meaningful relationship with my father today. But it wasn't just the visits. It was the time in between visits that was key, and my parents' continuing and unfailing efforts to find ways to invent parenting from a distance. Everything from letters to phone calls. When I was struggling to read, my parents decided that the two of them, from their respective prisons on opposite sides of New York State, would team up and get me involved in a family letter writing competition to see who could write more letters. And of course, to write letters to them, I had to work on not only my writing skills, but also my reading skills so that I could read and understand the letters they were sending me. At the time, I was 8 or 9 years old, and the letters they sent were pieces of construction paper with maybe just a sentence or two. But the competitive spirit took over, and I jumped headfirst into the competition. Of course, they let me win in the end, and by the time that year of school was over, I was reading with the rest of my classmates. It was that kind of creativity on their part and that kind of commitment and dedication on their part that helped me get past that feeling of being unloved, that feeling of being guilty, of being responsible for something that, of course, I had no role in and no ability to understand. I could go on at length about the problems with the status quo, with the way that prisons currently work and the way that families are torn apart by the prison system. But I guess for me, the main message is that, sure, there's lots of ways we can improve prison visiting rooms. We could convince states like New Hampshire that have a policy prohibiting toys in the visiting room, that's not a very good idea. We could encourage states, in countries around the world to emulate New York's overnight visiting system and provide families with access to real meaningful interactions. But at the end of the day, there's a much, much simpler solution, and that's simply send less people to prison. So I want to introduce Debbie Kilroy, who's here, and she's from Australia. She, I'm sure, will talk about the note that I'm ending on, which is sending less people to prison. She herself spent time in prison, and she's has more degrees than I could possibly remember or rattle off, but she is a lawyer, and she does tremendous work on behalf of women in Australia who are parents or mothers facing incarceration. And she's also founded her own organization, which she runs on top of managing a caseload, which competes with my own, despite the fact that that's my full-time job. So I'm going to let you tell them more about your work, Debbie. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jesse. Before I begin, I do want to acknowledge that we are on Aboriginal land, the Coast Salish people, the traditional owners of this area, which we gather tonight. I'd also like to acknowledge where I come from in Australia, which is also a country that was stolen from its Aboriginal people a few hundred years ago. And myself, I live on Nullumpul land, where the Yagara people are the traditional owners. I'd like us, as I do and say whenever I speak in Australia, to always remember and keep in the forefront of your mind that we are an Aboriginal land, always have been and always will be. And to feel, as I do, quite honoured to walk on such a special place, and for the majority of you who live in such a beautiful place, which is owned by Aboriginal people. I also acknowledge Kirsten and Sam for organising this this week. It's been fairly heavy duty, I must say, so I'm a bit brain dead, but anyway, that's all right. Hopefully it'll function tonight. And but it's been great. The discussions have been great, and it's, you know, always wonderful to have women with us in our discussions that have lived prison experience, those that have been criminalised and those that have been imprisoned, because we can always know that they are the experts in this area and need to lead the charge in relation to any sort of change that we're going to make in relation to the issues that we're speaking about tonight. I also acknowledge the women who are in prisons, not only here but back in my country, and I know at the moment it's 1:30 tomorrow afternoon back home, and I was thinking of the women at home in the prisons where it's visits time, and women who are lucky enough, mothers, to have contact with their children in the visits area, as Chase described, which is more like where you visited your dad in that quite sterile visiting area. But what the mother will pay the price of by kissing and cuddling and holding her baby or her child this afternoon while she's visiting with them will be what in our country, and I know it occurs here, is what is called in law a dignified strip search, which is what we call in our organisation is nothing more than state sexual assault, which is legalised for prison officers to perpetrate. And I just want to explain how women are punished for that visit with their child or their baby or their children or their mother and family members. And a dignified strip search is this, where you would take off the top half of your clothes, give them to the prison officer, raise your breasts, flick your ears, turn around, flick your hair, open your mouth, then they'll give you your bra back. Put the bra back on, then you take the bottom half of your clothes off, everything, give them to the prison officers. You may be asked to turn around and you may be asked to squat and cough. If you're menstruating, you actually have to take out your tampon or your pad and give it to the prison officer. So that's what a dignified strip search is, and that's what every woman will pay back in my country to be able to touch and hug their children this afternoon. So I want you to think about that too, and what that actually means, or what that would feel like to you if that occurred every time that you had the opportunity to kiss and cuddle your child. Sisters Inside is an organisation, we're an abolitionist organisation, we don't believe in prisons, and that is our first starting point, and we work from that point forward. I know in my life that prisons will not be abolished. We will probably have more prisons in my country. We have a very conservative government that's going down a path at the moment of wiping out so many social services, so many diversion programs, so many supports prior to prison, during prison, after prison. So we're going to see a massive prison population increase. And we've already seen, since they've got into power, in less than 12 months, a 6% prison population increase in a jurisdiction where I live. And so it's really scary as an abolitionist organisation about how we can try and put the brakes on that, because it's like a moving train going a million miles an hour, and there's no anchor to throw that out. So it is about talking to people like yourselves in the community to understand who these women are. And I suppose, I was just introduced. Yes, I was a woman that served time, a lot of time in and out as a child and as an adult. But I'm also now a lawyer and a social worker and a few other things. The whole joke is about the A to Z letters after my name. But I suppose I want you to think about that, because what we do with criminalised women and women in prison is to treat them as the other. They are not like me. And I don't actually fit in any of those boxes because I'm in all of those boxes. So I want us to start thinking outside the bars, because prison, I believe, has become a subconscious landscape that when we think of a crime that's committed, we think of prison and we can't think of anything else. So I want to encourage us to be thinking outside the bars and not always think about agitating for longer sentences, punitive measures. We need to be able to keep women and their children in the community, because children will suffer and the next generation will suffer and the next generation again. And that will be to the detriment of all of us that live with any community. We need to build links with our neighbours, with those we live with, our neighbours and neighbours' neighbours, and our community. And that's where it starts, those conversations about how we're going to address certain things in the area that we live, and not rely on state control by calling the cops or calling welfare or whatever else it is. We need to be thinking outside those state control processes and start taking responsibility ourselves and for each other, bound within the relationships that we build. We don't need the state control. We don't need the police coming in to intervene, because in my experience, when that happens, it actually escalates the situation. It doesn't actually calm the situation down. So, and we need to think of the children in this and what that actually does to a child, being torn away. And I suppose what I want to finish on, I think I've got a little bit left, is when I think about children being torn away, I think about one of the Aboriginal women that I had the honour to walk with for some time. And she came to prison. She was an Aboriginal woman that came from the other side of the country, but found her way over in our state and then found herself in prison, and she was pregnant. She was taken to the hospital and her baby was brought on, and she was back in the prison within under an hour. One of the other Aboriginal women, who's an elder in the prison, rang me and said that, let's call her Mary, was back at the prison wailing for her baby. And because she doesn't speak English as a first language, she speaks Warolpiri, so only a couple of women could sort of talk to her to try to find out what had happened. And she wanted to know, obviously, where her baby was. And her baby wasn't brought back to the prison. So they asked me if I could try and find baby. So I make phone calls to, we call them the child stealers at home. I think you call them the Ministry of Child Protection or something here. But anyway, I track down the child stealers in the right area and try to find out where Mary's baby is. And then I find out, I talk to the worker who, the case manager of the situation, that said, yes, we have her baby and she's been given to a white foster family and she's fine. Well, how did you do that? And my interest was, how did you do that in law? Like, not only could you do that to a mother? And she said it's because we had the paperwork and Mary had signed the paperwork. So my question to them was, well, how did you actually explain to Mary what was written on the paper? And they said, well, we just spoke to her. She was silent and she agreed with us, which is a classic example of white fellas getting it wrong. And I'm not sure about Aboriginal culture here, but it is at home. There's an assumption by white fellas that if Aboriginal people don't speak out, they're actually agreeing with you. They're actually not. They probably don't understand what you're saying in this case because you didn't speak English as a first language, or they're not agreeing and they're thinking about it and they haven't had time to come back with an answer or a response. I said to them, did you have a Warolpiri speaking interpreter at the hospital? No. What do you mean? Well, she doesn't speak English. So then it started. But I mean, to this day, because I've run out of time, with Mary, her little girl is being raised by a white middle-class family, has no contact with culture. She was being brought up to the prison, but the prison officers and the child stealers, child protectors or whatever they're supposed to be, would intervene when she would speak to her in language and told her that she could not speak language to her baby because they didn't understand what they were telling her. And so therefore, I don't know what, maybe Mary's organised an escape plan with a 2-month-old baby, but it made no sense. But it's white fella thinking. It doesn't fit with Aboriginal culture. And when we have such overrepresentation of Aboriginal women and men and young people in our prison systems across this country and across Australia, it needs to stop. We have to stop criminalising the first peoples of our country and other women and, for that case, men and children. It actually doesn't work. And I'll just finish on this quickly. And the reason why I say it doesn't work comes down to this. At home, 67% of women go back to prison when they're released, okay? Now, if I ran this church here, for example, And I'm sure they want to make money. Well, maybe a church is not a good example. But anyway, but I'm sure they want to make some money. If they had a 60% reduction in people coming and using this church, they would actually be thinking how they could go out to the community to assist and bring the numbers back in, yeah? Or if you run a business, for example, and your customers drop by 67%. We don't do that in Australia around prison systems, and you don't do that here. You actually allow the government to pour billions down the throat of a fundamental failed system, and it has to stop. If we want prisons as a community, we have to be also responsible and start asking questions about who's in there, what's happening, and why is there so many women returning, and why aren't they, in the first instance, left at home with their child, being able to undertake an alternative than incarceration that actually destroys that bond and destroys that family. So I'll just leave it on that note.
Our next speaker is Sharon McIver, who is herself an Indigenous rights activist and a feminist, as well as an academic and a lawyer. She is a member of the Lower Nicola Indian Band located right here in British Columbia, and she has many decades of experience fighting on behalf of both women in prison and women outside of prison who suffer abuse at the hands of the state and at the hands of men within their own communities. In addition, one last thing I'll tell you about Sharon is that she was the plaintiff in the McIver versus Canada lawsuit, which played an instrumental role in forcing the federal government to amend the Indian Act with the so-called McIver amendments. Sharon.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I've worked a long time in this area. Or in this kind of work, and I guess I should tell you that I am Aboriginal. I'm Ilaketmach from a little community outside of Merritt, British Columbia. I was born on my territory. I live there today. My mother, grandmother, far back as we know, was born on that territory, as are my children and grandchildren. So we haven't moved very far from our home territory, although I've traveled the world in this kind of work. And thinking about women in prison, I can recall when I first started some of the work, not all that long ago. I mean, we're not even going back 30 years. One of the things that came up with the women in prison, the pregnant women in prison, is that there's no facility in the prison for them to have their babies. So they would take them off to the local hospital, but because of the regulations, they had to be handcuffed and shackled while they were giving birth. So that the regulations said that they couldn't be outside of the facility without being handcuffed and shackled. So there were a group that took that on, and I can tell you today they're no longer handcuffed and shackled when they're giving birth, and thought that was a great leap forward. And then there was an issue about a pregnant woman from Saskatchewan, and they're going to transfer her to the only women's federal prison in Canada, which was in Kingston, Ontario. And she fought that move, and successfully. So the result was that she got to stay in a men's prison in Saskatchewan. She gave birth, and she wasn't able to keep her baby, but her mother and sister were looking after the baby, so she was able to see the baby. And I thought, well, that's a step forward. And then looking at the number of Aboriginal women in prison, well over 50% of the Aboriginal or the federal population right now. And if you go into the provinces of Saskatchewan and Manitoba, it could be at any given time up to 100% in one of the provincial jails, Aboriginal women. And they make nowhere near 100% of the population of the province. In the federal penitentiary today, there's over 50%. As Aboriginal women, we make up about 2% of the federal Canada's population. So very much overrepresented. And thinking about, well, we moved ahead. They're no longer shackled when they give birth. They can actually give birth without being handcuffed and shackled to the bed. Move forward, and yes, that they opened some new prisons, so the women don't have to go quite as far from their home when they're in prison. An improvement. And then you look at, well, what happens when they give birth? What happens to those babies? What kind of contact do they have with the babies? And you're looking at another generation. So historically, we have Europeans coming in and starting to do a whole lot of things, and you've got a very early piece of legislation that affects the Indian people of the country. And when the population of non-Indigenous, non-Aboriginal people got to a critical mass, there were movements around, taking care of the Indian problem. And one of the biggest movements was the opening of the residential schools. They said, okay, we'll put legislation in place that says Indians from age 5 to 16 have to be educated, with supporting legislation that said if you didn't allow your child to go to school, then you could be arrested, and were arrested and put in prison while they dragged your 4 or 5-year-old off to school. Many of the kids went to school for 12 years without having any contact with their parents. They were prohibited from speaking the language. Debbie talked about the supervisor saying, don't speak the language because we don't know what you're saying. Well, in the schools, the children couldn't speak the language, even if that was the only language they could speak. Not only were they punished for doing it physically, like being strapped, and punished in some of the schools, the supervisors would put needles through their tongue if they caught them speaking the language. And they also taught them about how horrible their home was, how horrible their families were, how bad the reservations were, and they should aspire to better than that. They should do better than that. They should get an education and leave that behind them and not worry about it. Fast forward to around 1960, they started, 5 generations later, they start phasing out the residential schools. And then what happens? They make an agreement with the provincial social service agencies to say, okay, now that the kids are back in their own homes, we need some kind of child protection. So we had an era which is called the 60s scoop, which means that very many Aboriginal children were being apprehended for need of care over that period of time, and were adopted out. They never went home again, and many of them had horrible experiences like they did in a residential school. I talked about, the punishment and the needle through the tongue and all of that kind of stuff. Well, in addition to that, there was horrendous physical and sexual abuse. So you've got kids coming out of there, adults coming out of there that couldn't parent. They were self-abusive and abusive to others, their learned behavior. And you get into the fostering system, and those of you who work in the field know very well that those kids out on the street that, if you go down to the kiddie stroll, most of them are foster kids. They came out of the foster system. They've run away. But you've put thousands and thousands of Aboriginal kids into the foster system, and because they were North American Indians, they were able to be adopted across the border. We've got many Aboriginal kids that were apprehended from their homes here in Canada and adopted out into the United States at a hefty fee. The adoption agencies in the United States were paying a good amount of dollars per head for those kids, and so off they went down there. And so you're today in our child protection services across the country, we have more Aboriginal kids in care today than were ever in the residential schools. And that's today after the 60s scoop, and they've put into place legislation that says, sets out some protocols on how you deal with an Aboriginal child when it's apprehended. And so, but what we have, and what is very clear, and if you have, any of you have done any research and look at the speeches in Parliament and that when they were changing the legislation, the only result they wanted was to get rid of the Indians, get rid of the Indian problem. Assimilation, that was the word that was used, assimilation. So now we're looking at a large percentage of Aboriginal women in prison. And so what is happening to their kids? We know that those kids, as Debbie alluded to in Australia, those kids are going into white foster homes. They're being, those babies that are born in the hospital and are apprehended and taken away when the mothers are sent back to prison, they're being put into white foster home and white adoptive homes. So what we have is a whole process of, since contact started to today in 2013, a process by which assimilation is happening. And for the women, the Aboriginal women in prison, for those women, their children are being taken, they don't bond with them, they have no connection to their home communities. They have, although they should, we do have legislation that says that they should be have contact with their communities. They should have Aboriginal foster parents if possible, Aboriginal adoptive parents if possible. That's not happening. And Debbie was telling me about the situation of the little girl in her country, where they were attempting to reconnect her with the community, but it was too difficult because she had no idea of who they were, because she'd only been in this white middle-class foster home and potentially adoptive home. And so what is happening is that this method today is being used as another form of assimilation. Those women in prison, they're not good parents. They're not allowed to parent. Their families, because they're in prison, probably aren't good parents for this child. But if you look back, that the assimilation process that affected the women in prison, and many of them are residential school survivors or children of residential school survivors, survivors of the fostering system, that's what's produced the women in prison and the way that they're coping with the world. And so from my perspective, our perspective, it's just another tool of assimilation. And until we can get our women out of there and get them to be bonding with their kids and raising those kids who they are. They're Indian kids, they're Aboriginal kids. They belong to us, they belong to our community. And when that child, Debbie's situation, when that child grows up, very dark, in a white foster home or white adoptive home, when she grows up, she's likely to be one of those statistics. And so what they're saying that they're preventing by taking it away from a bad mother is actually they're perpetuating it for at least another generation. Thanks.
Thank you, Sharon. Our next speaker comes all the way from Nepal. Pushpa Basnet was the founder and is the president of a remarkable organization called the Early Child Development Center and Butterfly Home. Pushpa founded the Butterfly Home when she was studying social work at the age of 21 back in 2005. Her work was so successful that in 2012 she was honored as a CNN Hero of the Year. And the work that she does with children is something she'll tell you about, but I want to mention briefly that the children in the home she runs in Nepal have made butterflies, which are for sale outside, I believe for $3 each, and they're on keychains and they're wonderful, and I'd encourage you all to take a look at the photos that she's brought from Nepal and also buy a butterfly keychain. Pushpa.
Namaste everyone, and thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to speak about my work, what I've been doing so far for 8 years. I would just like to start, like, how did I end up doing this thing? It was 2005, back in my college time when I was studying my bachelor in social work. Because throughout my school life also, I was very average student. I was not good in studies. And I went to a bachelor college, and I studied in one of the best university in my college. At that time, I had got a chance to visit the jail. And when I got a chance to visit the jail, the first time I knew that in prison, like, there were children living inside the prison, because I had seen some of the organizations running this kind of work. But until and unless when you don't see it through your eyes in a practical way, you don't know what's happening. So I got a chance to visit the jail in Kathmandu prison, which is one of the main city prison. And when I got my chance to see in the prison, I saw this small girl. She was 8-month a girl, and she was just playing in the ground with her mom. Her mom was just washing her clothes, and I just went and hold her. I just grabbed her, and one of the security police said that don't hold her because her mom is little bit she's mentally problem, and I just kept her down. But when I kept that baby down, she just hold my clothes. She just hold my clothes, and I feel that she's calling me, and she's calling me to say that, please take me away from this prison. And it was really hard for me to forget that girl, because she was small and she had a big cheek and she just gave me a beautiful smile. And I feel that I need to do something. At that time, like, I came back home and I told my parents that, I saw a small girl in the prison. I wanted to do something. And my dad, especially my dad, I could see that no way, Pushpa, you can do something in the prison. At that time, what had happened was, like, because I was really naughty in my college, I was been suspended for a year from my college at that time. So that was a good time for me and the perfect time for me, because I could start something, And so I wanted to start this organization, but it was not easy task for me to work inside the prison because I was too young, and it was really hard for me to convince the mother to tell them that I'm going to take your children out from the prison at the daytime. And even for my parents to convince that, I want to start something, because I was being suspended a year from college and, like, getting into all problems. And especially my dad was really worried that, tomorrow definitely I will land up in the jail myself only. And that was thing happening, And when I talked to I talked to a couple of my friends that, we should start something because we studied a social work, we have to do something. But it came to a point when we had to collect a fund to start something, Slowly your friend also started to go away because you had to collect a fund. And it was a big responsibility to start this work also. But finally, I got the money, $1,000. With $1,000, I started that organization. I can still remember also. And we went back to the prison, and I talked to the jailer, the warden of the prison. The jailer who is been appointed from the government said, I told them, so I want to start something, and he could see me like, I wanted to do something, but he said that, what you want to do? I said, I want to start a program inside the prison. And he said that, why you want to start a program inside the prison? It's nothing new, Pushpa. You should start a program outside the prison. And I was like, no way I would start a program outside the prison, because it was a big risk to take these children out from the prison. Anyhow, I started, I registered as an NGO, and I did all the procedure and everything to start this organization. But I never knew what would happen next day. So we went with our paper, we were standing in front of the jail with the balloons and the dolls and everything. The children were so happy to come out from the prison, because that was the first time in their life they were coming out from the prison. These 4 children were born inside the prison. And we were also so happy, finally they are out. We took them to our place, it was just 15 minutes drive from the jail. They were so happy, they stayed with us. But after an hour, they realized that they are away from their parents. Then they started to cry. Whole day they cried, And for me also, at the one point, I realized that I made a big mistake in my life. That was true. My father said, don't start this thing. But for a week, same thing happened for a week, But slowly they realized that they are just coming out from the prison. And this thing happened for 2 years. I was running this same program, but I went to same back to my college. I graduated from that college, and everything happened. Within the 2 years, I realized one of my children had gone to a different orphanage, because he was already 6 years old. He was placed to a different orphanage. And I went to visit him. When I went to visit him, I realized that what standard I had kept him, like a family, I was there looking after me. It was not up to the standard. And then I realized that I need to start a residential home. Then I started a residential home with the 2 children. Now we have 45 children. From the age of, not exactly age, I would say, she is 1.5 months till 18 years old. And what happens in our country is if you don't have a local guardian to look after, then parents are allowed to take the children inside the prison. Which is some way, I would think that's a good point also, because if you don't have a local guardian to look after, tomorrow those children are easily being trafficked to the India. They are easily being used for the prostitution also. And one thing, what happens in our government is we do have a policy and we do have a system saying that, up to 6 years old, the children can't stay inside the prison, but the children have to be outside the prison. But in terms of the relationship and the bonding, it doesn't work out in our country. Even the jailer says we can't take these children out from the prison because, he's not safe outside. So that happens in our country also. But we want to show, especially organization which we are running, we want to show that, I know that we can't change totally the system in our country, but we want to show that, what are the possibility of these children whose parents are in prison, giving them a better environment, So every month, these children goes to the prison and see their parents, every month. Because I don't want them to feel that, their parents are in prison and they don't have anyone to look after. Because at last, when the parents come out from the prison, the most important thing is the bonding between the child and the mother relationship. How good the child needs to have good bonding relationship with the child and the mother. So far, now this has happened, but definitely I have been asked a lot of questions Pushpa, some way you are trying to show a negative point of your government, saying that, your government is not giving a system, it's not in a system, they are not funding. It's true, but sometimes I believe that, you should not always see on your government what your government had. Why don't you do it from your side also, as a good citizenship also? So that is the thing that as a youth, what we are trying to do back in our country. Because today, if we don't give this to children, tomorrow they are not going to give to others. And I believe in that also. One thing I just want to share this thing to you all is when I started this organization, I had such a big crisis of the money because I was very young. I never had the money to do anything. Even I started to steal. I started to steal in my home also, steal my parents' money and even start selling my own goals to look after these children. Today, at this point, I feel whatever I did, I steal and I steal this thing for my home, but it's good for these children. Because they are my future, and definitely tomorrow they'll give back to the society also. But coming to this international roundtable, I've heard from so many people, these children, they can't see their parents often, hearing all the children's story. I think that yes, it is true that our country is poor. People know that our country is really poor, but regarding the bonding between the child and the mother, I think it's far more better. What I feel is that, personally I feel is that, and I would think that tomorrow these children will be the better future, and definitely I look forward for these children to come and stand in my place to tell about the story, what has happened in their life. And we do have children from, they come from a various background. Especially, we have the children whose mother are in the prison. Because in our country, they believe that the girls should not be educated. If you give girls education, that's not a profit, because she'll get married, she'll go to another place. But if you invest on a husband, it's more like if you invest on a boy, it's more profit also. So that's the thing also. So mostly my children parents are involved into drug case, dealing with the drug trafficking and domestic violence. And in our country, what happens is like, if a mother is caught by a police or anything, if they are involved into crime, even the family they don't try to get contact with them because they think that she has cut down our nose and they don't want to get contact with them. But if a son is in prison, definitely they look after their grandchildren because they will say, that's my son. So that happens in our country also. But I think now things have changed. Like 3 years back, if my children were walking in the road, people used to just say, look at these children, this children comes from a background, whose parents are in prison. They will never turn out to be a good. Now I can definitely see it. Like, if they are walking on the road now, they say, look at this children, this children has been looked after by CNN hero. So things have changed. Things have changed now because it's how you portray them also. Things have changed. And I really feel surprised also. Now it's like they take a time to just come to us and take a picture. Because of the time and everything. And I really look forward for these children to have a better future in tomorrow. Now we've been looking after 45 children. Still 80 children are living inside the prison. Now I can't rescue all the children because due to my financial problem also, and we don't have infrastructure also. But definitely I look forward to rescue these more children. And we do have a program of getting these children back to the family. Like after the parents come out from the prison, they go back to the family because that's the most important thing for them also. And that's how we've been doing so far. And please look at the picture. Like you can see the conditions of the prison inside the Nepal. Like yesterday I got a chance to visit the jail out here, which was really nice to see, like how system things are there. And I think in our country, like even they don't have a proper bed to sleep. Don't talk about health and care. Not even a child would get a proper food to drink, proper food to eat, even a proper water to drink also. The condition is really bad in our country. Health is far more, to talk about health, it's beyond the imagination also. So these are the few things that we've been doing so far. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Pushpa. Next, we have Jeffrey Cowper, Queen's Counsel and Senior Counsel and leader of the litigation group at Faskin Martineau, a local office of a law firm here in Vancouver. He has won numerous awards. I won't even try to list them all, but I will just tell you very briefly that in addition to his active work as a senior partner at his law firm, he has an extensive array of experience in public interest work and pro bono work, including I think it's 3 terms in charge of the local British Columbia Legal Aid Department.
Well, I'm sort of afraid that I'm going to be another white fella getting it wrong here, and I'm wondering if I should. I'm hopeful that I'm going to be a white fella getting it right for a change, and I also want to change my name to Bushpa, I think. So thank you for having me, and I'm here to speak about sort of a local development that we're handling in court, which is starting on May 27th, and my co-counsel, Sarah Roach, is here. Sarah, you could stand up and get some applause. But we're taking the cause of women and babies to court in the BC Supreme Court in a couple of weeks, and we're arguing under our Canadian Constitution that they have a constitutional right to have babies go into prison with their mothers in appropriate circumstances, and that both the mothers and the babies have a constitutional right. Sam asked me to sort of connect myself to prisons, which may not be obvious, but my father was born in prison. He was actually Anglo-Indian, born in a prison called Yerovda Prison. And so I grew up, I was born in Canada, but I grew up with stories about prisons because he grew up in a prison, and so one of his memories was his father was a big fan of Indian languages. He spoke 27 Indian languages, and he learned those because he would assign as a prison duty language tutorials for himself. So when a prisoner came who spoke a language that he didn't speak, his rehabilitation involved teaching my grandfather his native language, and so he gradually accumulated all these languages. And the main innovation he pioneered in Indian prisons, for which he did receive a number of awards, was the pioneering of occupational training for Indian prisoners, because this is going back to the 19-teens and the 1920s. In the India of the day, if you were convicted of a crime and you actually went to prison, you couldn't return to your village because it would be unacceptable. And so you had to go to the city, and very often you were unable to earn a living except through crime. And so you had this terrible cycle where the only way you could survive would be to return to a life of crime. And so he tried to break that cycle and did something to break that cycle of educating and training Indian prisoners into jobs that they could have when they released it. One little moment of fun is that when my father was a boy, the most prominent prison inmate was actually Gandhi, and he was imprisoned for 7 years in Yerovda prison. And last year, my brother, who is an international engineer, went to the prison to see what it was like for my father to be there. And in the interim period since we last heard of it, they made it a memorial for Gandhi. So you go in and it's all festooned in flowers and it's all nicely painted and everything else, and you can Google it if you want. And we'd like to think of it as a memory of my father, but other people think it's Gandhi, so you can take it either way you want. My father was more famous in our family than Gandhi, but I guess other people have a different view. So let me just outline the case for you, and I'll talk about, I think, where a lawsuit like this fits into our cultural conversation, both in Canada and internationally. So the legal issue, which may be the least interesting of it, but under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the people have, every person in Canada has a variety of rights. One of them is the right to life, liberty, and security of the person. And in explaining those rights, I think historically they've tended to be defined from a very male point of view, firstly, and a very singular point of view. They've tended not to be defined in the way in which we all live out our lives, which is in families and in culture and in society. And so it's not surprising, perhaps, that in Canadian prison history, we've separated mothers and their babies, and we basically regarded the separation of a mother from her baby as just the freight that comes with the social sanction of imprisonment. And the two things that we haven't thought about are the social consequences of the mother being separated from her baby, which have been, I think, horrific through the generations, as well as the consequences on the baby, both physical in terms of not being breastfed, not being able to bond with the mother as a newborn, but also longer term in terms of attachment disorders and those things which afflict those children very often who are placed into foster care. So our proposition roughly, and to give you a little bit of a history, some visionaries in British Columbia tried to bring mothers and baby programs to the British Columbia prison, and they actually established a program which for a number of years had mothers and babies assessed, and then when it was safe and appropriate, they stayed together, and they had 12 mother-baby pairs who went through the program. It was evaluated. It was seen to be successful at a number of levels, and then prison administration terminated that in the spring of 2008. And our case is basically that the benefits far outweighed any of the risks, and that it was terminated arbitrarily. And we say, in essence, that if we're to take our constitutional rights seriously, take the rights of babies seriously, take the rights of mothers seriously, that they have a special right to be considered in respect of staying together, and that needs to be taken into account in the management of prisons, and if necessary, in the design of prisons and the management and oversight of prisons. We're also arguing that the right to equality under our Constitution is also implicated, and I won't get into that tonight, but that's an issue arising out of the circumstances of women in particular, in that it's effectively discrimination against women, because you could say that there's equality, both men and women are separated from their babies when they go to prison, but of course the implications and the impact on both babies and mothers is different in category for them than it is for men. And the other dimensions to the case, which are interesting from the previous speakers, is it is pretty heart-wrenching to think about the fact that we take babies from Aboriginal mothers when they go to prison unnecessarily in British Columbia in 2013, when you have the history that has been spoken of by some of the previous speakers, where for generations we've had forceful separation of children from their families, with the result that they've struggled to be parents and effective parents and had a legacy in their own lives of trying to overcome that experience. So it's double heart-wrenching to think that we're still institutionalizing that experience and the challenges that come for both mothers and babies in that experience. And of course, it's equally heart-wrenching in my view that we are still disregarding the implications on families and mothers and babies of that separation. So we're going to trial in a couple of weeks, and Sarah promises me that we're going to win, and we're going to do our best. I thought I would just say a couple of things in the non-legal sense, because I think a case like this fits itself into a broader conversation, because the reason that it's possible to not have a program for mothers and babies is because the culture supports the separation of mothers and babies, right? It isn't something that people overlook. It's something that generally, I think, ultimately we have to persuade the culture and our society as a whole that it's sufficiently important that we actually demand of our elected representatives that they give instructions for that kind of program to be made available. A lawsuit is a fine way of focusing on that and reminding people of their rights, but the ultimate security lies in our cultural values and in ensuring that our elected representatives, and we are in a democracy, recognize the importance that we place on it. And so gatherings like yours, I think, are an important part of that conversation. And I think one of the things we're coming to realize through this, generations of both agony and also achievement that people have had in overcoming these challenges and in addressing those challenges, is that the idea that you can focus on just a woman and ignore her children, whether they're outside the prison or in the prison or newborns or otherwise, in the context of how we focus on what brought her to the prison as well as how we would seek to have her integrated in the community, is an impoverished view of humanity, and that we need a richer and more appropriate view of how people relate to one another and how they make their way through life. So hopefully our lawsuit, in its modest way, will hope enrich that conversation and bring about a return to a more balanced view of how we treat people who come into contact with the law and the justice system in that way. There, thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Our final speaker on the panel, is Sharon Content from my hometown of New York City. Sharon is the founder and president of Children of Promise, an organization based in Brooklyn that provides crucial services to over 200 children of inmates every year. It's the kind of organization that helps make possible for so many kids the supports and services that I was lucky enough to have right within my own family. The services they provide include after-school programs, summer camps, mentoring, mental health, and so on. Sharon?
Good evening. Good evening. I bring you greetings from Brooklyn, New York, and I want to say I want to thank the facilitators of this wonderful conference and International Roundtable for allowing me the opportunity to meet individuals that are as passionate as I am about incarceration and how it impacts families and society. As again, my name is Sharon Content, and I'm the founder and president of Children of Promise NYC. We are the first and only after-school program and summer day camp in New York City, designed specifically to meet the needs, interests, and concerns of children of incarcerated parents. And our program is unique not only due to the target population that we serve, but we are unique in that we infuse youth development with mental health services. So mental health services are impacting all aspects of our program, in that we provide some of those traditional services that you would receive probably in the YMCA probably in the after-school program here in Canada. So we provide those traditional services such as your academic support, your recreational programming, but then we infuse mental health so that every one of the young people in our program is partnered or receives one-to-one counseling as well as group counseling so that they can come together as young people all impacted by incarceration in a safe setting, in a place that they consider their after-school program, their summer day camp, but we're really able to deal with the issues and the problems and the challenges they have of having a parent in prison from the inside. And it's a holistic approach. It's a comprehensive program in that we provide services that impact the whole child, not only from the academic support and the recreation aspect, but also from the caregivers. We provide a level of support to the caregivers that are now raising young people who have a parent in prison. And that might be grandmothers. We have a large number of grandmothers that are raising their grandchildren as a result of their moms being in prison. And they have stepped up to the table and really have raised their grandchildren. And these are grandparents that love their grandchildren, but now have to raise children when for so many of our grandparents, they're like, I did this already, but now they have to. Otherwise, their grandchildren could, in some cases, go into foster care, and of course we wouldn't want that to happen. So our grandparents are now raising our grandchildren, as well as young people that we have that are in the foster care system, as well as single moms who are now raising their children. So we provide support services for the caregivers so that because we realize it will trickle down and now help the young person as well. So we have to impact the entire family. Our program is also very unique in that our young people come into our program on a daily basis, Monday through Friday, 3 to 6:30 during the school year. And then in the summer, they're with us for a full day from 8 to 5 p.m. So for our young people, they come to the program seeing it as, again, a safe, fun space and a place they come to that they own. But then we're able to provide them with the mental health services that are so important that allow them to deal with the depression, the anger, the loss, and for so many of our young people, the separation and the anxiety, and for so many of the issues and the challenges that they're having, but we deal with it from a mental health perspective. So again, that we're able to impact the whole child. And right at this particular time, we serve 200 young people per year, and our program allows us to it's unique in that our young people, we partner with so many of the agencies in our community, and that's how so many of our young people are referred to the program. So we partner with other community-based organizations in Brooklyn so that not only schools, initially when we started the organization, I thought I would just go into the schools and the schools would refer all of the young people. But unfortunately, for so many of our young people, the stigma and the shame and the secret, the schools weren't aware of the parental incarceration. They weren't even able to refer the young people because they didn't even know which of the young people in the schools were impacted by incarceration. So what we did a lot of grassroots marketing. We went into the community, we went into the train stations. As you know, in New York, we go into the trains, into the bus stations, we went into the housing projects, and we really reached out into the community so that we could really identify some of the families that were impacted by incarceration. We also partner with a number of agencies that provide those support services. So it's kind of a reciprocated relationship in that they refer families as well as we refer families who receive those support services from these various agencies. So we partner with agencies in the community that make the referrals, and that's how we really are able to we're able to have 200 young people that we serve on a yearly basis. One of the other things that I want to talk about concerning some of the young people, and so you can just kind of get a picture of the day that we day-to-day kind of a picture of the organization. So not only are our young people coming into the program, again, after school at 3 o'clock, but they come in with the perspective of this is their organization. They come in, again, not recognizing it as being, because we really identify the mental health services as the services that are really going to impact and make that change, because our goal of the organization is definitely to break the cycle. That's the goal of the organization, because we recognize that children of incarcerated parents are 9 times more likely to repeat the cycle. So we identify the population, but we know that if we are able to provide services that allow us to break the cycle, it's really through the mental health services. From the inside out, allowing the young people to come together and be able to talk in a safe setting. For many of our young people, it's in a group setting, it's the one-to-one counseling that allows them to really be able to talk about so many of the issues that they're having on a day-to-day basis. And I really am happy to be able to have this opportunity not only to share with you about some of the issues and the challenges that our organization is able to impact, but we really wanted to be able to share some of these experiences, so hopefully not only from the colleagues that I'm able to meet through the roundtable, but as well as hopefully in the audience, it sparks some ideas, because we recognize when a young person loses a parent due to, let's say, divorce or military deployment or, let's say, death, there's a level of sympathy that society allows this young person to be able to share that experience and feel and able to receive some level of sympathy. For a child that loses a parent due to incarceration, that level of empathy doesn't exist. That same level of compassion doesn't exist. So I welcome the opportunity to speak not only about the services we provide and the population that we serve, but able for society, hopefully, to hear more about the challenges. And that way, I think by us really being able to talk more about it and being able to share the experiences of the families, as so many of the speakers have spoken today, but by you hearing about the experiences, I think you're able to maybe understand more about what the families are being impacted and how incarceration has impacted not only the children, but the families that have been impacted. So I hope this has been helpful and enlightening this evening, and I really appreciate the opportunity to speak. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. I have a lot of questions for the panel, but since I've gotten the opportunity to spend time with them, I'm going to let people in the audience go first. I see some hands already. I don't know if we have a microphone. Do we? Great. So give us a minute, and we'll get a mic to you so that everybody can hear your questions. And please start by identifying yourself. And if you have a question for a particular member of the panel, please direct it to them. And if it's just open, then whoever's interested can field it.
Kim Pate with Canadian Association of Elizabeth Fry Societies, and my question is directed to you. I was familiar a lawsuit was being launched. I have some real ideas about what legal strategies might be best employed, and I'm quite concerned actually when I hear about the remedy that you're seeking, because I think you're coming at it, quite frankly, from the wrong perspective. We should be arguing the right of the child to be with the parent, yes, but in the community. And if a fallback to a failure of that argument is child with mother in prison, that's a fallback, and one that we might still appeal. And I suggest that if it's not too late, and even if it is too late, that we start to do some work very quickly to correct that, because my worry is if you argue for mothers and children to be in prison, we'll see what we already know is a trajectory in this country and others, which is to say that it's okay to continue to jail mothers and children. And in fact, that's not the argument that I understood was going to be being put forth. And I'm really quite concerned that we do this before you actually end up in court. And I suspect a lot of stuff has been filed. But I think we need to, I don't want to end up on the other side of this case arguing that the remedy being sought is actually not the right one.
Sorry, Kim, the idea being that the court would order that women who have babies are not allowed to be imprisoned.
The right of the child.
I understand.
The right of the child to associate, the right of the child is a charter-protected right to associate with her mother, period. That being first and foremost in the community, and it leave an option for programs to be in the prison, but the first and foremost, the mother and child in the community where there are supports available.
Yeah. Okay, well, I'll answer the question, and maybe we can speak separately about legal strategies, but the case originated when the mother and baby program was canceled, and it arose out of the cancellation of that program. So it arose in respect of those mothers who were going to be in prison no matter what. And the question was whether or not their babies were going to be able to stay with them or be separated. So that's the historical origin of the case. And so you're right in the sense if you want to be alarmed, you can be alarmed in the sense that our fundamental remedy is in respect of the women who are not going to be allowed to be in the community. Now, one of the consequences of our case, I think, has been that prison administration has said that whenever possible, we will manage the various tools, including the ability of the warden to give relief and probation and terms and joint submissions to judges for women and babies to not be imprisoned at all and to serve whatever sanction that is appropriate for them in the community. And that is the first choice, bar none. There isn't a need for, if you will, they're already doing that. That's, in effect, their defense, Kim. They're saying, we're doing that, and therefore, if you don't meet that bar and you have to come into prison, you're going to have to lose your child. So in some senses, we're dealing with what happens when you can't reach an agreement by a judge or a prison official that it's possible for the mother and the baby to be in the community. So, but I think in terms of the question, I think that's the best question. I think the more fine-tuned legal strategy would probably be best left for a separate conversation, but that's the best answer I can give tonight.
I just want to just briefly add to that. I don't know a lot about the particulars of this case, but just today we learned that in Brooklyn, New York, the district attorney announced that for women, including women accused of serious crimes, felonies, they were going to begin initiating a program to keep those women at home with their children. And figure out ways to do some sort of house arrest or other form of alternative to incarceration to avoid the consequences we've all been talking about today. It may not be appropriate in the context of this case. I don't know the facts, but it certainly is a real possibility, one that even in a country as conservative on these issues as the United States, we're beginning to see put into practice.
It's a program for 45 women, but women who haven't committed violent offences. So, and it's an extension from the District Attorney's program that he introduced back in 2008, which is called Drew House. So now he's announced today to, in partnership with the Women's Prison Association, as an alternative sentencing option. So if someone's charged with an offence but not a violent offence, and there's 45 spots for the house arrest. So, and I agree with Kim. I think we have to argue about keeping mother and children outside of prison in the first instance, and that to be the remedy, not to pander to the courts and those that... I think as lawyers, we have to expand the law and force judges to stretch their minds and not just stay in the narrow, being of it. I think it's our job as lawyers to move it out and expand for the benefit of, in this matter, for women who are being criminalised, and more so their children.
And I think it's important to know that that program wasn't a panacea. It was a stopgap until we got to other places. And the reality is, to argue for it to be reinstated risks exactly what has happened in the federal system, which is a functus program, a program that exists in name only, and in fact probably puts women and children at greater risk of having child welfare intervention once they're out of prison. And so I think knowing that research, knowing that reality is vital to the remedy you're seeking. And so I don't think it's just a legal argument. I think it's very much a strategic argument that is vital to the potential success, long-term, of a strategy of keeping mothers and children together. So I'd be very happy to do whatever work we can. I had no idea that it was going just on that kind of reinstatement model.
Do we have any other questions from the audience at this stage?
Hi, Sharon, when you spoke about stigma, I also looked at my own prejudice, of course, and questioned that. And then I went to how ancient that stigma is from the Bible. From Pushka, you spoke about that in some cases people couldn't come back to their families if it's a woman. And somebody else spoke about, I can't remember, about not being able to come back to the village. My curiosity, and maybe it's to you, Sharon, I'm curious, and maybe to you, Debbie, if you know, or other people, what alternative, when we look at the past, what did Aboriginal cultures do when women did things that were against the culture, if there was a murder, I'm curious, maybe there's answers actually from the past that we're not looking, that we don't need to reinvent wheels. Maybe there's traditional ways of dealing with things that we're not looking at. And just a question that came spontaneously, it might not be a relevant question, but the stigma, the Christian stigma, the Judeo-Christian stigma, and all that, I don't know what happens in Buddhism or Hinduism, just a curiosity around what does the world has to offer to the 21st century modern systems?
You want me to answer? Well, I'm not an Aboriginal person, so I can only pass on what I've been told by Aboriginal people. And, Aboriginal people in Australia were groups of people, very small, and so very tight relationships and very nomadic, yeah? And what I've been told is there was hardly any violence at all. But if there was something that happened, probably more closer to the years and when invasion started to occur, if there was something that occurred, a person would be banished from the group for a period of time until they were accepted back in. And that's the way that it was dealt with. Sorry? I have to tell you, I've never heard of any story that any woman was ever banished. It was usually a man. I've never heard of it.
I think in our country, if women, mostly in our country, because lots of domestic violence are there, if a wife kills her husband, she's never going to go back to the village. Never she's going to go back to the village with the child also, because she will be never accepted by the society. But in case of a man who kills his wife, but the man will go back to his society and he'll get remarried within a year. That's our society. That's our society because of a culture what we are living. If a man does anything, it's not a big issue, but in case of woman does that same thing, is that she has a problem. So society doesn't accept. Still, you don't have to go far in village, even in the Kathmandu main city where I live also, things happens. Thank you.
Jim Mandolin, how about healing circles, restorative justice, and sitting and bringing, like we were talking about, the community together to find a solution, a community solution. I think that's the ancient. That's the beginning, before it became pay the king, the state, all that kind of stuff.
I gave a brief history of the interaction and the intervention that's happened within our communities. And I agree with Debbie. I've done a lot of research on the issue of sentencing circles to resolve issues and that. And I couldn't get a lot of history on what exactly happened. There were incidences that happened that I was told were pre-contact. There were ways that addressed it. But as Debbie said, the incidences that were involved men only. I haven't had any reports where women have acted in such a way that they were a danger to the community. And the other piece is, which was almost totally destroyed through the residential school system, is taking care of each other. So we've got large extended families that things didn't happen. If they happened, they didn't escalate to a point where outside intervention happened, because we took care of it internally in a way that didn't involve power or abuse of power, which is that's what's happening in these situations. You've got powerful people that have the right to walk in and take your child, and you can do absolutely nothing about it. We didn't have that system, but we had a way of taking care of each other, and we have some of those in place. And I can tell you, in my community and other communities, we can tell you which families are going to get into trouble because they don't have a strong matriarch. You've got a strong matriarch, those kids are going to toe the line, and if they get slightly out of line, somebody in that family is going to pull them together, and they're going to take care of it. And we've done several projects, and we did that over a course of 10 years. In our own communities, where I live, we've got 5 separate Aboriginal communities. And we identified, a group of us identified the families where there would most likely be difficulties and where there would not. And the only criteria was that strong matriarch. And with a strong matriarch, she's got them all in order. And they do what they're supposed to do. They take care of what they're supposed to take care of. And you'll never see those kids go anywhere but being taken care of by the family. Seriously interfered with the system that I told you about. The residential school system, the fostering system. This whole idea that white woman can raise that Indian kid much better than the Indian woman can, and could give them better values so that they will grow up to be productive citizens. The ideas, the way that you raise your kids, what you instill in them are totally different. But the system, for the most part, is broken. And it's broken because of the interventions. And my message is that it's a continuation. And whether it's the taking of the kids and sending them off to residential school, taking of the kids, sending them into foster care, criminalizing their mothers and putting their mothers in jail and sending them off to foster care. It's just part of the whole spectrum.
My name is Meenakshi, and this is more so a comment. While I really, really recognize the importance of sentencing circles and a return to restorative justice, I think that it's really important to also recognize that the crimes that a lot of women go to jail for are they're modern crimes that have been crafted by the state to incarcerate them. They're, it's a part of the continuation of residential schools, the foster care system. These are very calculated decisions around why we put certain women in jail and remove them from society and effectively disappear them from the public consciousness. And I think that, I don't know, maybe it's we can talk about having women connected to their children in prison, but fundamentally, these women should not be in prison.
We're getting a little bit short on time. I have a question that actually is connected to some of these most recent comments, but before I put it out there, I'd like to see how many other hands we have. I want to make sure everybody who wants to speak gets a chance to do so. Is there any other comments from the audience? Okay, so maybe as a last question, just to wrap up, then I want to try to focus for a minute. I know we all come from different countries and different political persuasions and areas of expertise, but I recently read a study that I've been having a hard time getting out of my mind, and it focuses on the United States, but it relates to issues here in Canada and beyond. And what I read was that in the United States, for every dollar spent on legal aid, we spend $14 on corrections, and nearly double that on policing. I learned here in Canada this week that in the federal prisons, there's a budget of over $200,000 per female inmate. The resources, at least in the United States and Canada, are seemingly limitless when it comes to building prisons, when it comes to funding incarceration. And yet on the front end, both the kind of legal aid work that I dedicate my time to now, that Jeff has done so much in, that others on the panel have worked in, and even further upstream when it comes to preventing the kinds of problems, addiction, domestic violence, and so on, there's always a shortfall of resources. And so my question for people on the panel is how, as a practical matter, not just a theoretical one, how as a practical matter can we begin to reallocate those resources from the downstream prison system, which is a dumping ground effectively for people we don't want to see or don't have the creativity to deal with another way, to upstream, to make sure that there are effective child care, health care, drug treatment, whatever it is that would be needed to prevent the kinds of problems that lead people to incarceration in the first place.
Youth Criminal Justice Act was passed. It was passed because we were at crisis proportions of jailing young people under the Young Offenders Act. And it provided a legal provision that said every judge who sentenced a young person had to consider why they weren't first using the social services or child welfare system, the mental health system, or some other community option. And if they were going to look at jail, why they thought jail was necessary for the protection of public. It's a fairly easy, not easy, obviously, politically, but it's a very pragmatic way that the Canadian government already took, the Department of Justice took, to say we shouldn't be jailing kids. I think we could make similar arguments for why we shouldn't be jailing women. And most corrections people themselves would agree. Most women are not a risk to public safety. And in the mid-90s, all of the heads of corrections got together and considered men, women, and children, and remembering the majority were men, and agreed that they could release 75% of the people then in prison and not increase the risk to public safety. So I think we've already got evidence that's on the books that we could be using and arguing some very practical. So thank you for asking that question.
I mean, I'd make a couple of comments, and I think Kim's comment's spot on in that we've actually have some very successful stories to tell. It's not the right, the amazing decline in youth in custody in British Columbia is an amazing story that's happened. Now there's, I think, less than 10 youths in custody in British Columbia today. It's relative to 10 years ago. It's an amazingly reduced number, and we're getting better outcomes from it. I think, for my part, I think I try to bridge a bit of these worlds. I think obviously there's a lot of people here who are in favor of abolition of the idea of prisons. I think the strategic question is whether that's the immediate goal or a longer term goal, and what do you do in the meantime? I think that you need to find goals that can secure support from the general electorate, because I think there is a democratic cultural question here. And I think one of the great opportunities that we have now is that the greater transparency and ability to communicate success and the basis for success, I think, gives you a much better megaphone than it has in the past. So if you look at the United States, I think you have to change the conversation. There's been, as you know, an astonishing drop in the level of violence in the American highways and byways in the last 20 years. So in some cities, the level of murder is off by over 90%. So the average person goes, what do I not like about that, right? There's 8% of the murders in New York compared to 1980, say, rough there. I don't know if anybody's seen the Jogger 5, the Central Park 5 documentary that Ken Burns' daughter, I think, has made. It's a very moving documentary, but it relates to a conviction of 4 minority youths who were really deemed guilty against all of the evidence, but at a time when there was a huge hysteria around violence that was not unjustified, in that the levels of murder were pretty astonishing. And I was in New York at the time, and if you were visiting there on business, you were told not to walk in Central Park, period, full stop, at any time of the day. It was like this scary kind of place. And it has changed a lot, but we've imprisoned millions of men, And so what we have to do is figure out how we can get to a place where we secure the safety of the population without just warehousing people in unjust terms for huge periods of time. And I think we can do it. I think one of the key central things is the ability to educate the public in ways that we've never had before. But that's just one thought.
I believe that abolition is the actual core starting point. I know that prisons aren't going to be abolished in my life. There's probably going to be more prisons built in my country. In the jurisdiction that I'm in, the government is so conservative, so right-wing. They argue that they're about economics, but when you put the equation in front of them about how the evisceration of social services, diversion courts, etc., will actually create an increase in prison population, they dismiss that. They don't say that the economics are wrong. Many will say you're absolutely right, but this is about ideology, and that's not what they're not telling that to the community. They're not interested in anything else. They want to be seen to be hard on a certain group of people that they are groups of people that they are marginalising severely. So, as abolition as a starting point, that's where my thinking, our thinking at our organisation starts. And so therefore it's about decarceration strategies and about what that looks like. So anything we do, it's about thinking about how is this going to reduce the numbers? How is this going to reduce the number of women going in? Or how is it going to reduce the number of women going back in, for example? So that's how our services are framed and operate from, to reduce that as such. And also while women are prison. So, for example, and I know I've spoken about a few over the few days that we've been together, but one that I can think of that is inside the prison system is because we have a huge percentage of women in prison on remand that don't get bail. Bail is refused. And it's about 35% of women, which is huge numbers. So what we do is I train law students, and we do this for free. I train because lawyers won't apply for Supreme Court bail. We can apply, if bail's refused at a lower court, we can go to the Supreme Court. So we actually, the prison gives us, we have an agreement with the prison, they give us the list of the women who are on remand. I actually go through that list, I contact legal aid will tell me who their lawyers are and if they have a grant of aid to apply for Supreme Court bail, and it might be one woman out of 130, for example. So it's really, non-existent grants of aid to apply for Supreme Court bail. Then I will go in once a month and I will probably see 30 women on a Friday afternoon because I can actually quite quickly know who's eligible. Because sometimes a woman who's on my list it says they're on remand, by the time I get to see them, which is next week, they may have already been sentenced, so they're not eligible. So I may end up with 6, 7, 8 women out of that 30, and then myself and the students work on all the affidavits because Supreme Court bail is undertaken with paper, and files serve on DPP, which is prosecutions, and then we appear in court about 2 weeks later. It basically becomes a self-rep application, but most of the time the Supreme Court judges ask me to go into court as a friend of the court, not as their lawyer, and assist, because a lot of the Aboriginal women, for example, who can't read and write, that are in our system, I'm there to assist that process so that she can understand that if an order is being made to grant her bail, what that actually means and if she agrees to comply. And we've actually had a 100% success rate in that decarceration strategy. And none of those women have gone back to prison, because by the time that their matters are finalised in the courts, the court will either state clearly that she'd served enough time here on remand in custody, and because of everything that she's done to comply with her bail conditions, and life has moved on and she's okay, that she's not sentenced to a term of imprisonment. So it's been 100% successful. So it's about decarceration.
I just wanted to kind of bring up the political piece of what's happening in this country. The crime rate in Canada has been dropping for 8 to 10 years at a time when this government is intending to build new prisons across this country that may or may not be privatized. And I really think we have to bring the political piece out of this, that it's not being, that the gap in the understanding of the average Canadian is massive on what's happening in this country. And I think we have a real responsibility to make it clear that this is political.
Prevention. I go to schools and have since 1988. I'm a fully pardoned ex-convict, ex-gang member, recovered drug addict, alcoholic, all that stuff. And I tell kids my story. And then they tell me their story. Many, many of them over the years. But what I'm finding is there's no money. There's no money. I've searched for money for what I do. I've been paying for it myself. I went to school and got a counseling certificate, and I counsel adults, actually a lot of parents of troubled kids. But there's no money. Schools sometimes come up with an honorarium for my gas or things like that, but they'll put money into so many different things. the BC government, okay, just say no to drugs. And the kids that are like that I was like, and the kids that I help, that doesn't mean anything. They put millions and millions of dollars in these programs. And so prevention, yeah, it's a good thing. You know, teachers love it. I know many teachers in the Lower Mainland. But the system doesn't pick that up. And I remember years ago talking to a person from the United States, and they said that when they were discussing the beginnings of the DEA, the war on drugs, that the Congress sent out a bunch of people to do investigations and come back with this information. And the information came back is that which is the most cost effective? Of course, rehabilitation, these kinds of things, especially for addicts, is the best, you know, lowest cost. And the highest was, of course, for policing and the system. And which did they choose? Because it's an industry. It's a huge industry. So I think that should be talked about a lot more, the prevention part. Because I know myself over the years how many kids that have never gone to, well, some have gone to agencies because I've taken them there, but they just email me back and forth. And I've kind of become their father because their father's in prison or their father's dead or their father's an alcoholic or something. So I've just become their father, even over the internet, and sometimes meeting at Starbucks, which I do, meet kids. So that's got to be a big part of this. This whole thing is the prevention. Is catch them before they become. You know, my book that I wrote, my story. It's about answering the question: how do prisoners or criminals become criminals? How do gang members become gang members? They weren't born that way, and I hear the whys here, you know. So that I don't hear that talked about a lot. I talk about once they're in prison and what do you do with them and these kinds of things, but what's the prevention? So anyways, that's just a thought.
Thank you very much, and thank you all. I know we're running over our time here, and I want to give people who need to leave a chance to go. I hope that we've all given you some food for thought and also some concrete ideas to take action and spur you to action. Thank you all for coming.